In this video, I'm covering 5 Tarkir Dragonstorm draft lessons that you can apply to future formats. First, some formats only support a couple decks. While there is oftentimes going to be a system where there are 10 archetypes with 10 two-color pairs, sometimes not all of them are going to succeed, and you need to be able to adapt to the decks that are actually good and played. In Tarkir Dragonstorm, a very unique set because of the way the color identities were built, there ended up only being 2 main archetypes. There were the red-white based aggressive decks that were trying to end the game quickly, and there were these late game decks built around dragons or splashing a bunch of colors, oftentimes in the teamer colors that were going to be based around getting to the late game and then winning there with value and strong late game bombs. And the contrast between these two decks as the main 2 decks of the format really made the format unique and interesting from a gameplay perspective, because instead of there being the full range of aggressive, mid-rangey control decks, it was really mostly aggressive versus aggressive, aggressive versus control, and control versus control. These kind of mid-range decks got snuffed out because the card quality simply wasn't there, and that was a process that had to be adapted to, and is something that will apply to future formats as well, where once you know which archetypes are good and when you should be drafting them and what to look for when drafting them, you can really get a better understanding rather than just coming to the format as, okay, anything's good, I'll draft what I see as open and go from there, because sometimes even if a deck is open, it's just not good enough to compete. And so in this format, these are the main things you wanted to be doing. And in other formats in the future, there will similarly be certain strategies that are kind of pillars of the format, and knowing those is very helpful. Next, flexibility matters less than power, at least in this set, and generally there's been a trend over time. It used to be that you would struggle to make playables in formats, so you had to take flexible cards so that you would be able to have enough cards to build a deck at the end of the draft. But these days, there's so many good cards, and the filler cards are so much better than they used to be, that you'd much rather have strong cards that only fit into more narrow homes a lot of the time than cards that are weaker but fit into multiple homes. Let's give some examples to show what we mean. First off is a card like Disruptive Stormbrood. This card is flexible and powerful. This is the sort of card that if you take it early in the draft, it can fit into a black deck, it can fit into a green deck, it can fit into a black deck that splashes a little bit of green, a green deck that splashes a little bit of black. It's very flexible and very powerful as a result because it gives you a lot of options, and the card itself is inherently strong. So this is generally the sort of card that is flexible and powerful. However, there's also a card like Jeskai's Shrinekeeper, which is very inflexible because of its color requirements. It only fits into a deck that is blue, red, and white. Oftentimes in this format, you would splash it in these late game dragon or control decks, but it is still an inflexible card, but it was still worth taking early because the power level is there. So when you are able to cast it, it does a lot of work. Similarly, Salt Road Pack Beast, even though it's one color, is still a relatively inflexible card because it wants to go into that one deck we talked about, the red-white aggro deck. And the other decks can't really use it as well because white and red, like the decks that are trying to splash, aren't really playing as much to the board, so splashing this is generally not as strong as splashing other late game cards because you're just spending the full 6 mana for it a lot of the time, or 5 mana because you're not really playing to the board. It's not going to be as powerful for you, so you're not going to prioritize it as highly. But in early times in the early picks in the draft, you can still take this card aggressively because if you do end up in the red-white deck, it's going to be one of your best cards. And so, again, it's not the most flexible card because it's not like generically powerful to spell. Like a removal spell is going to be good no matter which white deck you play, but it's so strong in the decks it's good in that it's definitely worth prioritizing early. And it's still a good card in the decks that it's not at its best in. It's just like it's so powerful in the narrow homes where it's at its best that it's still worth taking early. And then we're moving on to some more middling cards. Overwhelming Surge is a very flexible card. It can be a deal 3 damage spell. It can kill non-creature artifacts. Sometimes you can even get the double whammy. But because 3 mana to deal 3 as a default mode is a little bit weaker, the card was not worth prioritizing. Similarly, Seize Opportunity, 2 in a red, 3 mana again for +2 plus a couple creatures getting +2/+1 is an okay effect, and exiling top 2 cards of your library is a nice backup mode, but again, because neither mode is individually powerful, the flexibility doesn't matter as much as the base rate power level. And then finally, a card like Reputable Merchant, which has this like mana cost that makes it relatively flexible in the homes it can go in because of the 2 Brid mana, so you can cast it even if you're just a green-white deck, even if you're just a black-green deck, those sorts of things. The fact that Reputable Merchant is just a weak card on its stats is going to be a sinker for this one, because if you're spending 4 mana for this, and you're not able to cast it for the 3 mana mode, or even if you are casting it for 3 mana, a lot of the times the card just doesn't stack up in terms of power level to what you really want to be doing. And so even though it has flexible mana requirements, it's still not a card you should be taking and playing. So keep in mind, power level is generally a lot more important than flexibility than in these days than it used to be. Next lesson. Early tricolor cards are just hard to cast. Tarkir Dragonstorm had bountiful fixing. it was really a set that emphasized playing multiple colors, but it was still really hard to cast 3-color cards on curve, and Skirmish Rhino is a perfect example of this. Casting this on turn 3 was not really that realistic. A lot of the times it would have to be cast in the later parts of the game, and that's one of the reasons why the card didn't really shine as much as it might have, because deploying this on turn 3, getting exactly the 3 colors you need, is just difficult and limited, even if there is plentiful fixing, even if it is a format that rewards you for going multiple colors. And sure, Skirmish Rhino did suffer a little bit from being in a weaker archetype as well. That's certainly a factor. And the fact that you get a 3-mana card is still good in the late game because you can use it to double spell with the other colors that you have available if you are on turn 6 or something like that and have 6 lands in play. But it's still worth noting that it is kind of hard. It is still just going to be hard to cast these 3-color cards, and this is the format that is designed to cast multicolored cards. So if you see a powerful 3-color rare or something like that in other sets that aren't really designed to be 3-color sets, definitely be wary and make sure that you have a reason to cast that card in the late game, because it's hard to cast these cards on turn 3 in Tarkir Dragonstorm, and casting them on turn 3 in other formats is even more unrealistic. Next, counterspells gain value against expensive bombs. This is a lesson that has held true for quite some time. When there's counterspells in formats, if the format is a slower late game format, then counterspells usually do better because counterspells are good and can answer any card, generally speaking. Whereas if you have to answer 1-for-1 with creatures that are already on the board, counterspells can rot in your hand and not do anything because the cards you need to answer are already deployed. So when there are expensive bombs in the format, counterspells get better. So a card like Jeskai Revelation, which is admittedly a mythic rare, but it's just an example of the sort of card I mean, where it's an expensive 7-mana spell that basically wins the game. It's really hard to deal with because it just has to resolve, and then it just does such a huge amount of things. Where a counterspell, like Dispelling Exhale or Spectral Denial, can answer that before it hits the battlefield, before it even resolves, and so you can actually negate that whole effect and prevent it from having an impact on the game. And so these sorts of cards like Dispelling Exhale in some formats wouldn't be as good, where getting on the board is more important, or there's a lot of really early aggression, so the counterspell, you're spending 2 mana, but you're not always able to hit their card before it comes on the board, those sorts of things, where you can't really afford to hold up your mana. But in this sort of format that's slower, and a lot of the times coming down to these late game versus late game battles, these counterspells can be absolutely key for handling those situations where your opponent has a really strong card that if it resolves, you lose the game, and counterspells really help with that. The final lesson to take for future formats is knowing the limiting factor is key. And by limiting factor in Tarkir Dragonstorm, I mean fixing versus powerful cards. And other formats have different limiting factors. So maybe the limiting factor in a format is how many 2-drops you can get because you really want to be aggressive, but there's not that many premium 2-drops in a particular color. Or maybe the limiting factor is removal because there's not that many good removal spells or something like that. So in Tarkir Dragonstorm, one of the questions going into the format is mana fixing going to be the limiting factor, or are powerful cards going to be the limiting factor? Do you have to take Nomad Outpost really highly because it can tap for 3 different colors, or can you afford to take Sonic Shrieker above it, knowing that you'll get the powerful fixing later? In Tarkir Dragonstorm, you were generally better off taking the powerful cards because the fixing was plentiful and you were able to splash these cards, but knowing the limiting factor is always going to be an important part of a limited format. It doesn't always have to be about mana fixing versus powerful multicolored cards. It can be, as I mentioned, things like 2-drops, things like removal spells, things like late game. All of these different factors and different synergy pieces for decks can be important, and it even can go to archetype specific things like, oh, do I need more of the enablers for this archetype, or are there enough payoffs so I do have to take the payoffs and then get the enablers? Or for example, a +1/+1 counters deck, are there lots of cards that put counters on things, or are there lots of cards that care about counters and I'd rather get the card that puts counters versus the card that rewards me for having counters? These are the sorts of things you figure out over the course of a format, and framing it this way in your head can really help you come down on the format in the right way and know what approach to take. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end, leave #TarkirFuture because hopefully Tarkir will help you do well in future formats. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe for more, comment with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.